Alright, welcome everyone to our first Patreon bonus video, and it is a nation guide for the much beloved but barely covered nation of Uruk. This is why we covered the Enkidu of last episode, and today I'll be looking at their middle-aged incarnation, Uruk. So, usual structure. We're going to look at what happened to our friends the Enkidu in between the early and the middle era, and also talk a little bit about the region that they're in terms of what's going on, because it's one of those cases where the strength of the nations doesn't quite match what the lore says happens. We're going to go through what has changed for the Enkidu roster, the most important thing being that the Enkidu have discovered helmets. Truly revolutionary, and something that transforms the military capabilities of the Enkidu. We'll go through their new roster, their new mage lineup, and then we'll talk about what that means for the strategies available to the nation, the overall balance of the nation. But let me give you a spoiler alert. I like Uruk more than I liked Ur, and I think it gives a lot of options for a player to work with. If it has a disadvantage, it's that it's operating in the Middle Age, where I generally think the highest concentration of powerful nations exists in the Dominions universe. The Middle Age is probably, I think, the most overall competitive. Now, with all that said, let's look at the lore for our Enkidu, because remember, when in the early era, the Enkidu of were just starting to come together. The city of Eridu, which was the first Enkidu city, had been founded, admittedly long after humans and other civilizations had founded their cities. The Enkidu had created one city, Eridu. At the same time, they still had significant populations living in the swamps or pastoral ones out on the fields who were still living quite wild lifestyles. And there was a slave population in Hinnom. Let's talk about that slave population first. Hinnom, in between the early age and the middle age, gets absolutely dumpstered by Abyssia. I know. No one who plays Dominions would pick it, but apparently yes. Hinnom is dumpstered by the so-called Tide of Fire, which is an Abyssian expansionist war, and as a result, the territory of Hinnom shrinks considerably and now concentrates around the twin cities of Ashdod and Ashkelon. As a result, we can't find evidence of these large, formerly enslaved Enkidu populations before. At the same time, the Enkidu who are centered around Eridu have founded additional cities. So we've moved from being a single settlement of Eridu as the capital to a loose conglomeration of city-states, and each city has a sort of specialization. So there's a city of scribes, it's mentioned, the city of merchants, merchants in the city of trade. And there are lots and lots of petty kings and rulers ruling over these various cities. Now, that has meant a reduction in the power of the sort of pastoral Enkidu. It's also meant the shamans have been sidelined, as the focus is more and more placed on these Ensi. And I want to draw a distinction here now between what happens to Uruk because this is a game of dominions, that is, because you start an ascension war, versus what seems to be happening and what we can guess might happen if there is no ascension war. If there is an ascension war, then what was happening, wherein there was strife and turmoil between the various cities, and the kingdom was being ripped apart, and lots of inter-Esine conflict between the various parts of like the Uruk's realms, that's sort of put aside. The new god comes along and causes a bit of a religious awakening. In the City of Gods, there's a new temple raised, and one particular segment of this nation's religion becomes dominant, so the Temple of the Moon. And that's where you see things like Maidens of the Moon and particular religious rulers. The priestesses of the first city move to the City of the Gods. They break their traditional power structures. But following on from that, all of the various city-states come together and join in a common cause. Uruk's first city, Eridu, still stands as sort of a symbol of, I suppose, unity in the civilization. But the religious power is centered on the City of the Gods. So instead of fracturing, the Enkidu come together and they're ready to fight for you in the Ascension War. Now, in the scenario where there is no Ascension War, so the lore just continues racing on towards the late age before you hit the Ascension War period, we're not sure what happens. because there's no late age equivalent, at least not yet, nor can we find significant evidence of, and people correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't find any significant evidence of large populations of Enkidu in any of the other civilizations in the late age. Which makes me wonder, was the breakup of the city-states, so where they started to fight each other and attack each other in the Middle Era, without an ascension war to bring the population together, did that continue to the point where they essentially collapsed as a civilization and were eventually destroyed or absorbed, presumably by Abyssinia, probably not by Ashdod because they get pushed back further to Gath in the late age, but new nations pop up in the area that are sort of combinations. So Raga appears, for example, that might not be in the same territory as Uruk. Either way, it seems to be that while they develop better technology and organization, unless you step in the Middle Age, the future of the Enkidu is very uncertain. So it's almost your duty to play the Enkidu as Middle Age Uruk and see if you can lead them to a better fate. Let's talk about the new roster. The most immediate change you will notice is that we no longer have the foreign recruit line being really long, and we no longer have the swamp recruits at all. It's much more now about your fort recruits. Some of these are familiar, so I won't go over the premise of the Enkidu chassis again. Just as a reminder, it's a size 3, it's got good hit points as a general rule. The problem is that normally this chassis doesn't have particularly high skills relative to other size 3 units like cavalry, and has lots of, while it has lots of hit points, those lower skills are not normally enough to protect it or keep it alive in the face of things that are hit sufficiently hard to kill them. That said, they're still tough little buggers with lots of HP relative to their gold. You still have your longbow, it's still 14 damage, you can still do things like wind guide it, you can still do strength of giants, you can still put lots of damage on your longbows. Unfortunately, they still don't wear helmets. That's unfortunate. This is less decisive in the Middle Age because now crossbows have started to appear, and other archers like man's longbows are starting to appear, but it's still a unit that can stand on its own merits. Enkidu Spearman is another early age unit ported over, essentially, but now wearing iron scale mail. It's the same as it was. The problem is it's not good enough to replace the now helmeted troops that you have access to, and you have a good lineup and selection of them. The Enkidu Heavy Archer is a longbowman, but he has a helmet. You pay a few more resources for this. You go from 14 resources to 22, I believe. 14 to 22 in order to get 3 extra prot on the body and an extra 16 protection on the head. If you're going to have heavy archers, you better have a production build, but there's no doubting the fact that gold for gold, they are obviously the better unit. The melee troops are probably more interesting to a lot of people. You have 3 varieties that aren't sacred, all of which are useful in different ways. The Incudu Soldier exists to be your low recruitment point option. We now spend 22 resources because we're armoring in iron. So we've got a scale mail hauberk, and we've got a cap, and we've got a shield. So now we're at protection 14. Our defense is still not great. Our shield is accounting for a lot of that defense, but we still have lots of HP, we hit relatively hard, and now, just even though we have terrible defense, we've got enough protection that we're probably going to live for a fair while with our extra hit points, and maybe we'll hit some things at attack 10 and do some damage. But mostly, this troop is a sack of armored HP, and he's decent at it. His advantage is that he has low rec points. The Royal Guard has considerably higher rec point cost. We're up to 15 rec points. Same resources, only 1 extra resource, I think. We're up to 20 gold as well, so a 4 gold premium. What do you gain? You gain skills, better skills across the board. Attack 11, defense skill 13. You gain additional morale. I think you gain additional magic. No, you just gain additional morale, and I think 2 more hit points. You go over to a short sword, and you gain the bodyguard skill. This is a premium non-sacred close combat option, but when you compare it to 2 human infantrymen, suddenly it seems decent because it's resource efficient in terms of how many armored hit points you're getting per resource. The rec point cost is not huge. It's still got a lot of hit points, and it hits very, very hard. The alternative, if you want to hit even harder, is the Enkidu Iron Warrior. The Iron Warrior loses Bodyguard, but gains Berserker 1, which makes it higher protection. The recruitment points are slightly higher. So what's the advantage here? Well, the advantage here is the Berserk, basically. It's them not routing, which might be important. They're very slightly harder to kill because of that 1 extra Berserk protection, and they hit harder. So you're going to hit more often because your defense skill is lower, but you're going to hit harder, and you're going to stay in the fight thanks to Berserker. This is a decent unit. These are the tribal Enkidu who are now part of the regular army, and that's kind of cool. The Sacred is okay, but also interesting, I think is the right way to put it. There's advantages and disadvantages. So the Maiden of the Moon, these are the sacred warriors of middle-aged Uruk. They are raised from orphans and others who are trained in the temple, so similar sort of idea. Like there's some alignment with like the Vestals of the Roman nations in terms of concept. The idea is they're a group of sacred warriors who have no connections with like families or interest groups outside the religious hierarchy, so they can be trusted to defend the interests of the religious hierarchy. These are the Adeptus Sororitas of middle-aged Uruk. Unfortunately for religious reasons, they wear bronze rather than iron, and they have fewer hit points than their male compatriots, which is a little bit unfortunate, but they're quite good in all other ways. The resource cost is higher at 35, but the recruitment points are still only 16. 27 gold is not bad for a size 3 sacred. And then let's have a look at what you get. Attack skill 12, defense skill 13. It's above average, but it's nothing special for a sacred. Magic resistance 13 is good. Morale 14 is great. Protection 17 is pretty good. Like we're getting up to very respectable numbers here. Encumbrance 9 is a problem. Like, make no mistake, Encumbrance 9 is a problem. These ladies will fall asleep unless you find a way to keep them awake in longer battles, and then they'll start getting critted. Until then, however, they're very tough. They also have Formation Fighter 3. So what this means is, nominally, a square of Maidens of the Moon can contain 9 size points, 9. That's enough that you can fit 3 Maidens of the Moon into that one square. So you can have the same density as human troops, only you're packing something like 63 HP rather than 30 HP into that square, and you're launching 3 attacks at 18 damage. This Formation Fighter, however, also means, and this is interesting because one of the blessings I would consider for MA Uruk is Enlarge. And this has been mentioned by some people, including the person who commissioned this video, that larger is worth considering. Now, the stat line isn't oppressive by itself, but even with larger, you can still fit 2 maidens into a square. They'll get extra hit points, extra strength. They'll hit harder. I think it goes up to like 21 or so. We'll show them in a moment. And they now have length 4, which is a much more repellable weapon. So there we are. Interesting thoughts on the Sacred. It's held back in some regards, so this 9 encumbrance hurts it, for example, and the lower hit points compared to the non-sacred Enkidu. However, you're going to be saving on upkeep, and there's a whole bunch of blessers that might make them better than before. The Meshusu Chariot is another interesting unit. So the Meshusu are no longer sacred in the Middle Age. Uruk's gotten over its obsession with them being super cool and awesome. Instead now, they just put chariots on them and ride them around. Yeah, okay, look, let's talk about this. It's still limited recruitment, by the way. It's still 1 per turn, and we're now spending 200 gold. So this thing is as expensive as 2 war elephants, which is important to keep in mind. It's got 19 hit points, 14 prot, 11 attack, 12 defense. Now it has 3 attacks, but it's normally going to be trampling instead. It has unsurroundable 2. What'll happen is this thing rolls into combat. It'll get surrounded and killed. When it's killed, you lose the rider, and it becomes a 60-something hit point Meshusu, which still isn't sacred, by the way. However, that Meshusu doesn't have trample, unlike the chariot. It goes back to having its ordinary attacks, and it's a little bit vicious. Without being sacred, however, unless you're really fluffing these guys with the mages that are associated with them, they're likely to die, or they're likely to have units get around them to kill the mages that are escorting them. If they are to be used, I would see them used with other parties again for the fear bubble. I would have them arrive either just ahead or just after the rest of the troops in an expansion party to provide a fear aura. They'll get some trampling in, but they'll be surrounded by enough troops that they won't be cut down themselves, because each Meshusu Chariot you lose is an expensive loss. Full disclosure, for the expansion test that I'm showing off today, I did not use these guys at all. I tested them in another one, and I found that you could get decent results out of them, but they were finicky compared to just making the best use of the Enkidu troops and more conventional expansion tactics. If you practice a lot, maybe you'll get something out of the chariots. Your foreign recruits, you've now got an iron armored but still hatless Enkidu that you can wreck anywhere. He's 14 resources, 9 wreck points. This is still important in terms of optimizing expansion, because you can do partial rebuilds of your parties on the fly by just building up a couple of Enkidu, because it doesn't take too many to make an expansion party. So you can use that foreign wreckness in order to, I suppose, give you reinforcements at the front and save you going home, which is handy. The Kalulu are the same that they ever were. However, if the Kalulu were in danger of being outcompeted in the early era, they are woefully inadequate for the middle era. Everyone's got their act together underwater in the Middle Age compared to the Early Age, so everyone's even more lethal down there. This is the age of the Meteorite Guard. This is the age of Pelagia's lawnmower sacred underwater cavalry. There's going to be Morvark Knights under there. The underwater territory is never more harsh and hard fought than it is in the Middle Age. In the Late Age, things ease up, because Relay in Fluff kills everybody and drives them out of the ocean, but Relay in the game kind of sucks, so as a result the water's not particularly direly fought over. Late Age Atlantis usually just takes it, and heck, even German can get a look in. But in the Middle Age, you're going to have a rough time if you're fighting with Kalulu. Again, the main advantage of these troops is that by reason of their existence you can build underwater forts, and that's an advantage. Let's talk commanders. The theme here is that we've given up our death access, and we've given up our really big nature, and to an extent we've given up some of our era thugging potential. But in exchange, we are now a communion nation, and we got Astral flowing out the wazoo. And you know what? That's pretty damn cool. Let's talk. The Enkidu Scout is no longer foreign wreck in the Middle Age. This is unfortunate. You have lost your intelligence advantage, but other than that, the Enkidu Scout is still the Enkidu Scout. Enkidu Commander is still the Enkidu Commander, only now he wears iron rather than bronze. Enkidu do not make great commanders, as a general rule. 40 leadership is not great. The Naditu. The Naditu is a 70 gold sacred, so half upkeep, 7 RP, Astral 1. This is a good mage. This is a good mage right here, because you're only spending 70 gold, you're halving the upkeep, so the annual upkeep is 28, nice and cheap, and Astral 1's just one of those useful paths. This thing is an Astral Slave, this thing can also be, I suppose, a Master. Being a size 3, it's got a base of 19 hit points. If you find a way to boost this above 20, you'll suddenly be getting even more regen. It makes them more useful as the base plate for your communions. But your Naditu is your base communion slave. The Nin gives you Water 1, Earth 1, Astral 1, or Nature, and is again around that 70 gold mark, is still a priest, only now you can random, if you want, access to these other paths. So there we go. The Gala is your guaranteed nature priest. So if you want nature, you're going to recruit the Gala, because she's also your elegist. These other guys are not elegists, and they're not spell singers, and generally spell singer is better. So if you want astral, you're going to make Naditu, which is a lot of the time. If you want to revive your god and you want nature, you're going to make Gala. And if you want to roll the dice for water or earth, you're going to recruit the Nin. decent combination of 70 to 75 gold, size 3, and remember, bigger mages is better than smaller mages because big mages are much less likely to be killed by all sorts of battlefield wides or remote attacks, etc. It's better to have big communion mages as long as they're not too expensive. These guys are not too expensive at all. Are there cheaper Astral ones in the game? Yes, but 70 for a Sacred Astral one is still a pretty good deal. I'm going to take it, especially since you're probably going to take magic on Uruk. That's some efficient research. The Guru. People might remember the Guru from the early era. Another repeat along with the Gala. He's still a priest 1. He's a lesser priest of the Old Faith, not the Faith of the Moon, which is what the Awakening God and the City of the Gods is going on about. He's lost one of his paths, though. He used to be either 2 air or 2 earth, both of which were good and functional thugging path, and air 2 was a cloud trapping path. Now he's a little bit sad. He's air or earth 1. The reason you would get him over the Nin is because of the air path in that. So he's where you're going to get your air 1 if you want it. Again, also a cheap, efficient researcher, but nothing particularly special, and he's lost a lot of the thugging potential he used to have. Can you do a little bit with Air 1 and Earth 1? Yes, but not as much as you used to be able to do with Earth 2 or Air 2. The Ashipu is new. This is a disease healer, 130 gold now, so we've almost doubled the price, but we're up to 9 RP, and here we're getting Astral 1, Nature 1 as the guaranteed set path. Disease healer is nice to have somewhere in your list. Other than that, what this means is if you're supporting big nature spells, he might be a more efficient communion slave because he's less likely to die. He's also some guaranteed nature, but you'll see we have more guaranteed nature in the roster. He's not inspiring, but remember he's there. The Ishiba continues to be not particularly impressive. Ishiba is another old school unit. He used to be water 2, I believe. Now he's water 1, priest 2, and then he can be up to water 2, also air 1, earth 1, N1. You're paying 150 gold for a priest 2. Look, he's not that bad for a holy 2 with a little bit of magic on his face. I just don't think you're going to be recruiting many of them because, again, you've got higher level options that are probably more attractive. One of them is this thing, the Ereshdinger. Ereshdinger? I don't know. Ereshdinger, however you want to say that. This is a High Priestess of the Moon, so she's significant because her religion has become more dominant. She's up to 190 gold, but she's a Priest 2, Astral 2, Water 1. The Water 1 path is nice because it means if she's at the head of the communion, she'll usually be at the head of the communion. There's some nice little water self buffs you might want to throw in there as well. No random, so you know exactly what you're getting. But note that what we've got here is a lot of Astral Priest. Astral Priest. Not just Astral 1, Astral Priests. And what you might be seeing here with these communion-compatible priests is that Uruk loves a good Holy Communion. Loves it. If you come up against Urmor or Asphodel in the early game and they don't have magic resistance, mate, just wire together a Holy Communion, boost your leaders, and because remember, Holy Communions are fatigue-free, boost your leaders to Holy 4 or Holy 5 in the front rank, and just drop the biggest banishers the world has ever seen to strip their army down to nothing. It's a sight to see. There aren't many nations that do Holy Communions as efficiently and effectively as Uruk. The NC is bloody expensive for what he is, to be frank. He's a better commander and he's holy, so those things go together well. Water 1, Nature 1 means he can be tough. He can even be an off-thug with these paths, especially since you add a random Astral, Earth, Water, Nature. It's expensive, but you can off-thug with this thing. My problem with it as a thug chassis is you're paying a lot for Holy 2, whereas all I'd really want for a thug would be Holy 1. I just want it to be able to bless itself. Other than that, it can lead sacred parties and things like that, but you're held back by this 215 gold investment that you need in order to get this thing on the field. That said, water, nature. You can get water, nature, earth, and that's the ability to Iron Skin, personal regen, personal quickness. Like, that's a pretty damn good combo, although you'll be pretty fatigued after that. Same with adding the astral in. Look, like I said, there are options there. It's pretty tough. It's capable, but it's expensive for what it is. And then 2 capital onlys, the Enkidu and the Meshusu. The Enkidu is the top sacred for your roster. So this lady is inspirational +2, 40 leadership. She comes old, which is unfortunate, but she is a priest 3, astral 2, water 1, priest level 3 with a random on water, earth, astral, nature, and a 10% chance to roll again. Hypothetical maximum for astral. This is neat because it means your holy communions. You give her 2 communion slaves. She's holy 5. Throws the ability which ups everyone's priest level. Like, the amount of sacredness that you can throw out from these from Entus with a couple of Naditu. Stupid. Meshusu is sacred. Again, the theme is just about bloody everything that leads in this nation is sacred. The commander isn't. The scout isn't. Everything else is. Not everything is a priest, but it is sacred. Meshusu is guaranteed astral 3. You recruit a statistical average of 4 of them, and you will have astral 4. It's also a way to get astral earth cross-pathed. You can also do that using your Enkidu, but he's going to have 1 higher level on the astral. So, Earth Astral, Earth Boots, you've got S3, E2, that's enough to boost. You can get yourself all the way up to S5, or even S6 statistically with a combination of Meshusu. You can climb bloody high in Astral with Uruk. Being able to get to S6 using an Astral Random, a Crystal Coin, and a Starshine Skullcap gets you to the point where you can start make the rings to boost yourself even higher. You can go way off the reservation with Astral Magic as Uruk. It's lots of fun. But that's primarily what he's there for. He's there for the S3, and he's got to roll at some other things. Fortune Teller 15, so maybe there's a case for misfortune. And then foreign recruitment mages way down. We've lost our death access, and that's really painful. We've lost our stealth troops. We've also lost our death access in our commanders. And our poor shamans. These guys used to run the show. You'll remember they used to be nature mages that were competitive with pans. They don't suck, and they're much cheaper now. They're much cheaper now, and they're still terrible at researching. But you've got N2, E1, so you've still got like Strength of Gaia sort of paths. You're still going to be able to forge nature sticks to get yourself up to N3. You can boost yourself in combat to N4. You can still do a lot of good nature magic with the Enkidu Shaman. Like, he's still capable of doing it. He just isn't the out-of-the-box Mother Oak, big battlefield-wide nature caster easily that he was in previous eras, and he might require more items or magic to get there. One of the examples of what you can do now is you have Earth Astral Cross, give him a Matrix, cross him in with your communion, and you're as high nature as you ever needed to be. I don't consider this a huge loss to the nation. It was better when they were big, but this is still a foreign recruitment N2 E1, which I think is a good path. He can even off-thug. He's capable of off-thugging with those paths as well. So there you go. And then underwater, it's a repeat. We've got the same old combination of Holy 2, Water 1, generic leader, the fast researcher with the astral potential random, and also a way to get to Water 3, I believe. Yeah, Water 3. And over here, the Kalulu Queen is the same as she always was as well. Anything else to mention on the nation? The fortified cities, so the forts are still the forts. The problem is now temples cost 600. So you already had expensive infrastructure with this nation. You're already spending more, and it was taking longer for you to get your forts up. Because all of your mages, all of them are holy, you are going to need to make temples. Except for the shaman, who you can still build with a lab and nothing outside of forts. So maybe that's another reason to recruit a couple of them. So what does this roster say to you immediately? Well, you've got a huge collection of size 3 mages, and you are a communion-capable nation. this instantly, and your sacred is not like overwhelming. This screams for a mage or a thug bless in order to get the most out of those communions. So communions benefit from the survivability of the mages involved and the extra hit points on them. And thugs also benefit from those things as well as resistances. Turbo communions are possible with Uruk. Small turbo communions. A turbo communion, for those who don't know, I'm going to assume most people do, is where you have a small number of slaves relative to the number of masters, and you're relying on regen and HP rather than keeping fatigue below 200 in order to keep people alive. Again, there's a case for a larger bless on Uruk because all of your mages will benefit from the extra HP. It'll push all of them into a higher bracket for regen. Your communion slaves will have 20-something hit points. In fact, we can check because I looked at it in this version. So here we are. Here's an enlarged Naditu. An enlarged Naditu has 24 HP, so she will heal 3 if you drop personal regen on a communion. That means that you could have 4 Naditu and 3 masters throwing up whatever magic they wanted, and they wouldn't kill the Naditu because they'd be recovering 3 HP per turn. If you look at this guy, Zainum the Ensi, as a potential off thug, he now has 36 hit points, so he's regenerating 4 per turn with his personal regen. He hits pretty hard. My sacred troops, where there might be some up here. Here we are. He's a Maiden of the Moon. Let's find one that's not afflicted. Are these all afflicted? No. Here we are. So she's now hitting for 21 damage and has 27 hit points base. So, you know, enlarge resistances, hit points, undying, it's all good. Things that are going to keep your communion slaves alive longer or make thugging more viable, all worth considering. So what are we now? How do we use these units? And do I need to talk about the mod inspector stuff first? Do I need to talk about the conjurations and summons? Look, we'll do it very quickly, but there's very little change from the past era, and I'm very keen to get onto the strategy section. Okay, so here we are again. I'm not going to go over these in detail because we did them in the EA video, and I'll refer there. Oogaloo are even more important in the Middle Age because you've lost ready, easy access to E2. So if you look at your recruitables now, there's nowhere that you can get your A2 anymore. You can just get your A1 unless you're relying on 10% randoms. And I don't know about you, but spending my time waiting for a 10% random is probably going to drive me nuts. So having something that can summon up Oogaloo, probably more useful or important than it was before, and they play more of a role for your nation in terms of getting air magic onto the battlefield. With one caveat to that, air 1's enough if you're going to be communioning. You can put a matrix onto an air 1, and if there's enough slaves there, you can cast whatever air buffs you want. Now this will cause a shit ton of fatigue to the communion slaves, but if you're using a HP based regenerating turbo setup or something like it, who cares? That said, Oogaloo themselves wired into a communion can get truly obscene in the levels of air that they'll get to. This might be a practical way to get Fog Warriors, Mass Flight, the really big stuff out. So, something to keep in mind. You're still going to have an air gem income because you can still search at air 1. So something that can summon the Oogaloo and take benefit from whatever blessing you're doing, right on. Keeping in mind that Oogaloo will benefit from all the blesses we're talking about, things like larger or resistance or HP, or things that benefit thugs, things that benefit communions, will benefit the Oogaloo just as well, because he too is sacred. Kusriku, they're the same as they always were. They're less impressive in the Middle Era than they were in the early era. They're still expensive. However, there are more demons about for them to kill, and if you have a really good bless, maybe they're good enough that you can benefit from adding a few of them into your roster to help you out. Anzu, Buffalo, no further comments. The Umu Apkalu is worth talking about in this era because you'll be able to summon the damn thing. Astral 5, whereas it was basically impossible for early age because you both needed to find the pearls or spend a lot on alchemy, and then probably have a god that was built with the idea of eventually creating the Umuapkalu. Astral 5 is trivial for middle-aged Uruk. The Meshusu mages will get you to Astral 4 after a couple, Astral 3 base, and you're very easily able to build at least 2 Astral boosters as Uruk. So you will get to Astral 5, and you can make Umuapkalu if you want. And once you do, they will be available to lead communions, at which point you have access to big earth, big water, big air, big nature, and huge Astral on a chassis which is survivable, exceptionally mobile, and sacred and generally awesome. They are expensive, but they are mobile and they are versatile. They're good to have around. There are better things to do than to thug or SC with an Umuapkalu, given its limited hit points and great expense, but it has a whole range of paths, and because of those paths, it's capable of doing almost anything. Keep this in mind. It doesn't add new paths, strictly speaking, to your nation, but does help you break higher in some of them than you might have otherwise. Specifically, water and air. This is your pathway up, but you're already at Conjuration 8 at this point. Something to keep in mind. It's possible, by the way, with an Umuapkalu to get the air and water elemental royalty. Using boosters, using astral magic path boosters to get your paths up. That's possible. Trying to think if there's other diversity calls you can do with your Umuapkalu. I mean, you could also, because you're already at Conjuration 8, you could just boost nature a whole bunch and get fairy queens, but you can also do it this way. It's decent. It's decent, it's expensive, and it's much more available to you than it was at the start. If we look at our heroes, these will be familiar. Well, one of them will be familiar anyway. Here's our good old friend, the Immortal Nature 3. And Nature 3 is now the best nature you get because you no longer have shamans. So suddenly, this guy's a little more important now, isn't he? He'll get you to Nature 4. He'll get you Nature 4, but you'll need to find a way to get him a Moonvine Bracelet in order to get him to Nature 5. So he's still cool, he's still useful, he's still immortal. Nothing mega special, but there he is, and still sacred. And then you get an Upkalu. And just like you did in the early era, again, very high water is the main thing here. Also, I believe your highest built-in earth until you summon really high-level stuff. Earth 3 is enough to bootstrap in a very serious way, and to roll this out across your nation. Kind of cool. Unfortunately for him, being a Holy 3 isn't particularly anything weird. Let's just see if we load worthy heroes, if we get anything new and interesting. Okay, Mod Inspector was having some connection issues, so we're back in the game. But that's good, because it means I can spend more of those valuable minutes talking about the strategy. When I talked about early age I was concerned about rush protection, I was concerned about needing to use your god to keep yourself alive, and indeed most of the recommendations involved either dormant gods coming out to help you out later, so dormant monsters or dormant titans, as I was recommending, and people were also commenting, including some quite experienced players, like Chris Lighthawk commented, around some good Awake Expander builds. Uruk doesn't feel as vulnerable in that sense, and I think that's for a couple of reasons. The first is the troop lineup is now just better. Provided you've got the production to pump them out, you can now get a reasonable number of much more survivable and capable soldiers than you did in the early era. The Incudu Royal Guard's not bad. The Incudu troops now are pretty decent. They can soak, they'll take pretty limited damage from ordinary human units most of the time. It takes a long time for a human to chop with an ordinary weapon, to chop through 26 HP at 14 prot. And in exchange, when they do hit humans with moderate levels of protection, so humans with 14 protection, they're going to hit real hard, which means that suddenly this size 3 unit's in a much better place than they were in the early era. The addition of iron armor, which is not much heavier than bronze, in fact I believe it's lighter than bronze in many cases, and more protective, plus the addition of the helmet, means that the troop lineup is now a lot better than it was. The Sacred can take a whole bunch of blessers to be serviceable in the early game. I tried Enlarged in this one, and it worked just fine against indies, but there's also an opportunity to take a whole bunch of different resistances or style blesses to help make your sacreds more capable early on. The other aspect is that the sort of magic you have available to you gives you a much clearer progression into the middle game, or rather much more flexibility in responding in case of emergency. Communions are very good on the defensive in the late, early, and early middle game. The reason is your research parks are full of communion slaves, full of them. So while it might not be economical to go on the offense with a large communion, it's economical to defend yourself with one. And defending yourself with a communion means that suddenly you have access to a whole bunch of magic. Any magic in that this nation has access to, all of it, all of the paths that it has access to base, astral, water, earth, nature, all of it, I believe it has a way to get all of them practically and easily, maybe with the exception of air? No, still air on the randoms. It can get all of its basic paths into communions super easily. So suddenly, we've got the ability to defend ourselves a little bit better. Our opponent who's coming up against us needs to take account of the fact that whatever research we have, we will probably have access to the spells in it to defend ourselves. And we've got a really efficient research core. So, make no mistake, we're still more vulnerable early than a lot of nations, right? Like, we are not Ashdod out of the gate. We are not Nazca once they hit Condors. This is a dangerous era to live in. But suddenly, Uruk's got a better troop lineup, and mages that function better as sort of oh shit buttons inside their capital. So how does that change what we want? Well, we want to be a little bit more greedy probably, in that we want a little more production in order to get our more resource intensive troops out. We still don't need an extra rec points most of the time. We probably still want our gold, we still want our heat 3. We want to go as high magic as we can in order to purchase, we want to go as high magic as we can in order to get efficiency out of the Nin and Gala and Aditu, this sort of lineup of 7 RP, 70 gold sacred mages. To make those efficient as possible, Magic 3 is great. Significant impact on your early research speed. Luck is now less important. We don't want to go Misfortune 3. No one wants to go Misfortune 3. But we don't need to go mega high luck. With some diversity heroes in there. Like, there's some of that still out there. But we also have a lot of fortune tellers now. Who's a fortune teller? She's a fortune teller. She's a fortune teller. Is anyone else a fortune teller? No? He is. Great. Okay, so we've got lots of fortune tellers, which means that at least our fort provinces are going to be protected if we have at least one of the big mages in them. They're going to be partially protected from the events, which is handy. So better troops, protection from events, so we can afford maybe 1 point of misfortune, or at least not going as heavy luck as we did. We also have access to communionable paths, so our mid-game plan can change. So in summary, our early game plan is adjusted a little bit now. We might want a little more scale, we can rely on our troops a little more, but at the same time we can also still leverage that elegizing god and bring out a Titan early if we want, or we can be a little more patient, take a little more scale, and focus a bless more on being patient and supporting mages and thugging in the middle game. Our middle game options are now much wider because we're a communion nation. So we can now look at our paths and say, well, we can go to any of the paths that have big, like level 4, level 5 research spells, which have high paths, but we can reliably hit them with communions. And because of the way communion fatigue works, single cast big battlefield wide spells or really dramatic stuff is a better idea if you're doing that sort of setup than a million small casts, because they both cause the same amount of fatigue if you've HP damage if you've already hit 200 fatigue. So you still have available to you all the conjuration options that I talked about before. You can still go up conjuration because you'll still be able to howl if you've gone up construction. You'll still be able to get a stick and howl. You'll still be able to do water, earth, and air elementals. You'll still be able to get your Oogaloo if you have something to get them out. So you still have this sort of diversity howl combination here. Kusariku, by the way, come at Conj 4, so there's options there. You also pick up Strength of Gaia, which means your nature mages can buff themselves a little bit more. So your nature mage with a stick can or in a communion can still do that in order to buff the entire communion's nature skill. It's still there. So conjuration is still there and viable. Construction is still important for going to at least 2, because you're still going to be thinking about potential research items like Thug Kit, etc., because thugging is still available to you early on. Alteration still has a range of options to you, only now even better. Self-buffs are super cool when you're using communions, because they keep your communion slaves alive. And of course, alteration is a great path for thugging. So, Iron Skin, Luck, Moss Body, which is a classic if you can cast it, and Water, Nature Water is a cross path that you have. Mist Form, Wind Guide for your archers. Getting Air 2 is absolutely possible, so if you want to make those longbows super deadly, well, at least more accurate, Wind Guide is there. Whole bunch of good stuff here. Swarm is still here. Elemental Fortitude to keep you guys alive is still here. And then at 5, we've still got Wooden Warriors, which is now even better for your troops, because now they have lots of protection. This is going to make them even harder to kill. Heck, you can Bone Melter with your Moss Body mages at the head of a communion. Moors the Earth. You can now do this. The power of the communion is being able to look at these and saying, yep, I can do these as long as I'm willing to pay the slave fatigue cost in order to do so. So alteration is still there as a viable one. Enchantment still has some good stuff for thugging as well. Personal regeneration. And of course, if you go up the path after picking up Cloud Trapeze, you'll get Foul Vapors. Foul Vapors is still in your back pocket if you want to take poison resistance, as I did, and throw this up. It's not hard, and poison resistant 10 sacreds with a good amount of hit points will take a long time to die to this, where other things won't. So hey, option is available to you. Anti-magic comes at 4 if that's relevant. You can absolutely cast this stupidly easily, obviously. Strength of Giants at level 3 means your longbows are going to hit for even more damage, and if you're having trouble bashing through something with 21 or 22 damage Enkidu, 26 damage is a lot of damage. So, good stuff there. Thalmaturgy. Thalmaturgy is now more useful because it's got all the astral stuff. So you've got your access to your communions, Mind Burn, Soul Slay, Teleport, Paralyze, and I think at level 5 we've got... Yeah, there we are. Soul Slay. Soul Slay at level 5. Nice and handy. Some of this stuff is niche, like Charm Animals, very niche. But, you know, there are options here. Probably wouldn't go as high, because the really good stuff in Thalmaturgy only comes sort of later, when you start looking at, like, Master and Slave, Astral Travel kind of stuff at level 9. You can absolutely Master and Slave, by the way. You totally have the paths to do super late game Master and Slave. But when I'm planning my game, tend to think mostly in terms of like, what is my first war going to be fought with? You have Ench, Thal, Evo, Alt, Conj, Const options. You have so many options available to you. And while it sounds like I'm copping out a little bit by saying you have options available to you, here is why this is an advantage. It's an advantage because your enemies, A, do not know what to expect necessarily. You could have gone one of several paths. And 2, once you identify your enemies and do your early Diplo, you'll have a good idea of what your enemy might be. And if they're a more one-note nation than you are, you can go for the research, especially if you've got magic scales, you can run for the research that counters them. No poison resistance. I took Poison Resistance Bless, or I have the ability to poison resist my units, which I do. Great, we are going Ench. Air Elemental is going to save the day. Okay, we're going Conj. Choices, choices, choices. Do I want to thug them? Okay, Const Alt. Construction gives you a whole bunch of greed options in the middle of the game, depending on how high you want to go. You're still not a Lightless Lantern access nation, which is problematic, but you have access to a lot of the good thug kit. You've got a lot of the good forging paths. You can do your Rings of Regen, you can do the weapons, you can do the Armor of Knights, you can do Vine Shields and Frost Brands and all that good stuff. On Holy Mage chassis with Holy Summonables, all of which, you know, are good to go. So options, options, options. What are some ones I'd personally consider? I think Construction 2 is really handy. Get a couple of levels for the self buffs. Pick your level 5. Good, like beyond midterm goals. Going to Alt 7 gets you mass protection, gets you Marble Warriors, gets you Fog Warriors, all stuff you can do. Go up a const enough to get what you need for your thugs and your matrices and your hammers and all that sort of stuff. But Alteration 7 has some options. Evocation can catch people off guard if they're not expecting you to be bringing out stuff. Again, you're a communion, so you can drop some surprising spells early on. If you want to, you can totally Falling Frost, for example. Just recruit some of your watercross paths. So N2 can do it. Ishiba can do it with the Matrix. Astral Random NC can do it. List goes on. That's probably more for surprising people than anything else. I'm a fan of the surprise foul vapors if people aren't expecting it, especially because enchantment continues to yield some good stuff as you go forward. So relief becomes available to you, which will help keep your high encumbrance sacreds and also your medium encumbrance troops going. Arrow Fend, handy. There's a whole bunch of good stuff right here as well. And you can keep going and find better stuff as you go on as well. Serpent's Blessing, so if you didn't take the poison resistance and you want to foul vapors, you can still probably bootstrap up to some of this big nature stuff. Mass Flight, super funny on Enkidu. If you've seen hairy wild men in steel armor flying, it's great. It's one of the things that will make you fall in love with Dominions all over again, and it's right there. Whole bunch of resistances at level 8. You can't get blood, and you probably can't get death, not practically, but everything else you can probably bring into play. And for those things where you can't get them, so no blood, no death, it's possible to bring in death on the god if you want. The problem is there's just no supporting infrastructure for death anymore. You no longer have recruitable death mages, and so I'm going to say something that makes it... This is kind of hard for me. I'd probably let death go. I'd probably pass on death. You have Astral. Astral is a late game path. Astral's a late game plan. You can go way up Astral. If you want to be it, you can totally be the one who goes for the Arcane Nexus. You can be the one who goes for the Wishes. Or both, if you're particularly grievous. You're not Pelagia, but you have a pathway to do it. That pathway runs straight through Meshusu with Astral Randoms. With the right boosters, that gets you to your 4, 5, 6, 7. You've gotten to Astral 7 with the Meshusu before you're talking about anything to do with like artifact boosters or anything. 7, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7's going to require 1 Empower to get to Arcane Nexus, which is not bad for a unit. And if you're lucky enough to hit the 10% random, you don't even need that. Or you get to high-level construction, you build booster. Like there's options, there's options, there's options. You have late-game options, you have early-game options, you have mid-game options, your troops are better, your mages are available for blessing, and for all those reasons, I think that Middle-Age Uruk is a stronger nation than EA I was saying that I thought EA was sort of below average to average. I think Uruk is above average. As a nation, I think it's held back a little bit by the fact that it's existing in the Middle Age, but I still think it's above the centerline. I think it's a good nation. I think the idea of cheap giant communions are always a good idea. I think the Jotunheim nations prove that. These guys may not have death paths in them, but there's a whole bunch of stuff you can do with the elemental paths. The fort problem's not particularly bad, and having the the cheap recall god with no path loss means you still have an extra tool that other nations won't have in the mid or late game, or heck, even in the early game if you go that way. You can still have a cool teleporting titan out there, destroying armies, supporting your forces, or being really hard to kill, and then just coming back whenever it's killed. It's a great little niche advantage, and I love it. I had a soft spot for the Enkidu in the EA, but I'm much more comfortable playing them in the Middle Age. You're spoilt for choice, so I can't dictate exactly what you do with this nation. What I can tell you is that it is a nation that will furnish you with the options to do whatever it is you want, and is much more forgiving than its early age cousin. So, to my patrons, I hope this answers your question and you feel that you got a good deal out of backing this one. Everyone else, I hope you've learnt a little bit about middle-aged Uruk and may or may not be more keen to use it in your own games going forward. Love to hear your suggestion on blesses for this one. With so many sacred mages and thugging potential and the recallable god, bless options are always going to be debatable. But I think you can play Uruk all the way from pretty heavy thug/god bless all the way up to a pretty scales-heavy communion nation. It works all the way. I just think the sweet spot is somewhere where you're taking advantage of the fact that all your communion mages are sacred. That's all for me from tonight. Hope you've enjoyed, and I'll talk to you all again soon. Cheers.